Hello, welcome back to Storytime. This is, of course, my Sunday stream where I always do the older ages, and right now we're working our way through the short stories of Sherlock Holmes. And I think these might be the last two adventures in, what's it called? The Complete Adventures. And then after that is a bunch of short stories for the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And let's see, what are the two? I think the two that we're reading today are the Naval Treaty and the Final Problem. And then after that, we'll probably come back to consider should we continue with Sherlock Holmes short stories, or should we move on to maybe a novel. And I've got quite a few to choose from because, we're reading public domain stuff. There is a lot of public domain, especially for adult, not as much for children. But, that's neither here nor there. I'm sorry, I am on the wrong setup. Luckily, it's just one little click and I can switch right over to it. There we go. That looks more like it. And this isn't the first time that's happened. I'm just, it's been a little bit of an interesting week. Where the bookstore where I work, we're about to open back up so that customers can come into the store tomorrow. And we've just been preparing everything. So we're about to find out what that's like. But I get a couple of days off, nice chill time where I can read stories with all of you, play games. Anyways, let's go ahead and get started with adventure number 23, The Adventure of the Naval Treaty. The July which immediately succeeded my marriage was made memorable by 3 cases of interest in which I had the privilege of being associated with Sherlock Holmes and of studying his methods. I find them recorded in my notes under the headings of The Adventures of the Second Stain, The Adventures of the Naval Treaty, and The Adventure of the Tired Captain. The first of these, however, deals with interests of such importance and implicates so many of the first families in the kingdom that for many years it will be impossible to make it public. No case, however, in which Holmes was ever engaged has illustrated the value of his analytical methods so clearly, or has impressed those who were associated with him so deeply. I still retain an almost verbatim report of the interview in which he demonstrated the true facts of the case of Monsieur Dubuc. Yes, it is Dubuc, of the Paris police, and Fritz von Voldbaum, the well-known specialist of Danzig, both of whom had wasted their energies upon what proved to be side issues. The new century will have come, however, before the story can be safely told. Meanwhile, I pass on to the second upon my list, which promised also at one time to be of national importance and was marked by several incidents in which give it a quite unique character. During my school days, I had been intimately associated with a lad named Percy Phelps, who was of much the same age as myself, though he was 2 classes ahead of me. He was a very brilliant boy, and carried away every prize which the school had to offer, finishing his exploits by winning a scholarship, which sent him on to continue his triumphant career at Cambridge. He was, I remember, extremely well connected, and even when we were all little boys together, we knew that his mother's brother was Lord Holdhurst, the great conservative politician. This gaudy relationship did him little good at school. On the contrary, it seemed rather a piquant thing to us to chevy him about the playground and hit him over the shins with a wicket. But it was another thing when he came out into the world. I heard vaguely that his abilities and the influence which he commanded had won him a good position at Foreign Office, and then he passed completely out of my mind until the following letter recalled his existence. Briarbrae, Woking. I guess that's where it's from. My dear Watson, I have no doubt that you can remember Tadpole Phelps, who was in the 5th form when you were in the 3rd. It is possible even that you may have heard that, through my uncle's influence, I obtained a good appointment at the Foreign Office, and that I was in a situation of trust and honor, until a horrible misfortune came suddenly to blast my career. There is no use writing the details of that dreadful event. In the event of your acceding to my request, it is probable that I shall have to narrate them to you. I have only just recovered from 9 weeks of brain fever, and am still exceedingly weak. Do you think that you could bring your friend, Mr. Holmes, down to see me? I should like to have his opinion of the case, though the authorities assure me that nothing more can be done. Do try to bring him down, and as soon as possible. Every minute seems an hour while I live in this state of horrible suspense. Assure him that I have not asked his advice sooner. It was not because I did not appreciate his talents, but because I have been off my head ever since the blow fell. Now I am clear again, though I dare not think of it too much for fear of a relapse. I am still so weak that I have to write as you see, by dictating. Do try and bring him, your old schoolfellow, Percy Phelps. There was something that touched me as I read his letter, something pitiable in the reiterated appeals to bring Holmes. So moved was I that, even if it had been a difficult matter, I should have tried it. But of course I knew well that Holmes loved his art so, that he was ever so ready to bring his aid as his client could be to receive it. My wife agreed with me that not a moment should be lost in laying the matter before him, and so within an hour of breakfast time I found myself back once more in the old rooms in Baker Street. Holmes was seated at his side table, clad in his dressing gown, and working hard over a chemical investigation. A large curved retort was boiling furiously in the bluish flame of a Bunsen burner, and the distilled drops were condensing into a 2-liter measure. My friend hardly glanced up as I entered, and I, seeing that, hang on a second. Yeah, it is 2-liter measure. And I, seeing that his investigation must be of importance, seated myself in an armchair and waited. He dipped into his bottle or this bottle or that, drawing out a few drops of each with his glass pipette, and finally brought a test tube containing a solution over the table. In his right hand he had a slip of litmus paper. "You come at a crisis, Watson," said he. "If this paper remains blue, all is well. If it turns red, it means a man's life." He dipped it into the test tube, and it flushed at once into a dull, dirty crimson. "I thought as much," he cried. "I will be at your service in 1 instant, Watson. You will find tobacco in the Persian slipper." He turned to his desk and scribbled off several telegrams, which was handed over to the page boy. Then he threw himself down in the chair opposite, and drew up his knees until his fingers clasped round his long, thin shins. "A very commonplace little murder," said he. "You've got something better, I fancy. You are the stormy petrel of crime, Watson. What is it?" I handed him the letter, which he read with the most concentrated attention. "Does not tell us very much, does it?" he remarked as he handed it back to me. "Hardly anything." "And yet the writing is of interest." "But the writing is not his own." "Precisely. It is a woman's." "A man's, surely," I cried. "No, a woman's, and a woman of rare character. You see, at the commencement of an investigation, it is something to know that your client is in close contact with someone who, for good or evil, has an exceptional nature. My interest is already awakened in this case. If you are ready, we will start at once for Woking, and see this diplomatist, who is in such evil case, and the lady to whom he dictates his letter." We were fortunate enough to catch an early train at Waterloo, and in a little under an hour we found ourselves among the fir woods and the heather of Woking. Briarbrae proved to be a large detached house standing in extensive grounds within a few minutes' walk of the station. On sending in our cards, we were shown into an elegantly appointed drawing-room, where we were joined in a few minutes by a rather stout man who received us with such hospitality. His age may have been nearer 40 than 30, but his cheeks were so ruddy and his eyes so merry that he still conveyed the impression of a plump and mischievous boy. "I am so glad that you have come," said he, shaking our hands with effusion. "Percy has been inquiring for you all the morning. Ah, poor old chap, he clings to any straw. His father and mother asked me to see you, for the mere mention of the subject is very painful to them." "We have had no details yet," observed Holmes. "I perceive that you are not yourself a member of the family?" Our acquaintance looked surprised, and then glanced down. He began laughing. "Of course you saw the J.H. monogram on my locket," said he. "For a moment I thought you had done something clever. Joseph Harrison is my name, and as Percy is to marry my sister Annie, I shall at least be a relation by marriage. You will find my sister in his room, for she has nursed him hand and foot into 2 months back. Perhaps he had better go in at once, for I know how impatient he is." The chamber into which we were shown was on the same floor as the drawing-room. It was furnished partly as a sitting and partly as a bedroom, with flowers arranged daintily in every nook and corner. A young man, very pale and worn, was lying upon a sofa near the open window, through which came the rich scent of the garden and the balmy summer air. A woman was sitting beside him, and rose as we entered. I'm sorry about that. "Shall I leave, Percy?" she said. He clutched her hand to detain her. "How are you, Watson?" said he cordially. "I should never have known you under that mustache, and I dare say you would not be prepared to swear to me. This, I presume, is your celebrated friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" I introduced him in a few words, and we both sat down. The stout young man had left us, with his sister still remained, with her hand in that of the invalid. She was a striking-looking woman, a little short and thick for a symmetry, but with a beautiful olive complexion, large, dark Italian eyes, and a wealth of deep black hair. Her rich tints made the white face of her companion the more worn and haggard by the contrast. "I won't waste your time," said he, raising himself upon the sofa. "I'll plunge into the matter without further preamble. I was a happy and successful man, Mr. Holmes, and on the eve of being married, when a sudden and dreadful misfortune wrecked all of my prospects in life. I was, as Watson may have told you, in the Foreign Office, and through the influence of my uncle, Lord Holdhurst, I rose rapidly to a responsible position. When my uncle became foreign minister in this administration, he gave me several missions of trust, and as I always brought them to a successful conclusion, he came at last to have the utmost confidence in my ability and tact. Nearly 10 weeks ago, to be more accurate, on the 23rd of May. Oh, that was like 2 days ago. Cool. That was yesterday. He called me into his private room, and after complimenting me upon a good work which I had done, he informed me that he had a new commission of trust for me to execute. "This," said he, taking a grey roll of paper from his bureau, "is the original of that secret treaty between England and Italy, of which I regret to say some rumours have already got into the public press. It is of enormous importance that nothing further should leak out. The French or Russian embassies would pay an immense sum to learn the contents of these papers. They should not leave my bureau, were it not that it is absolutely necessary to have them copied. You have a desk in your office?" "Yes, sir." "Then take the treaty and lock it up there. I shall give directions that you may remain behind when the others go, so that you may copy it at your leisure, without fear of being overlooked. When you have finished, relock both the original and the draft in the desk and hand them over to me personally tomorrow morning." I took the papers and— "Excuse me an instant," said Holmes. "Were you alone during this conversation?" "Absolutely." "In a large room?" 30 feet each way. "In the center?" "Yes, about it." "And speaking low?" "My uncle's voice is always remarkably low. I hardly spoke at all." "Thank you," said Holmes, shutting his eyes. "Pray do go on." I did exactly what he had indicated, and waited until the other clerks had departed. One of them in my room, Charles Goriot, had some arrears of work to make up, so I left him there and went out to dine. When I returned, he was gone. I was anxious to hurry my work, for I knew that Joseph, the Mr. Harrison whom you saw just now, was in town, and that he would travel down to Woking by the 11 o'clock train, and I wanted, if possible, to catch it. When I came to examine the treaty, I saw at once that it was of such importance that my uncle had been guilty of no exaggeration in what he had said. Without going into detail, I may say that it defined the position of Great Britain towards the Triple Alliance, and foreshadowed the policy which this country would pursue in the event of the French fleet gaining a complete ascendancy over that of Italy in the Mediterranean. The questions treated in it were purely naval. At the end were the signatures of the high dignitaries who had signed it. I glanced my eyes over it, and then settled down to my task of copying. It was a long document, written in the French language, and containing 26 separate articles. I copied as quickly as I could, but at 9 o'clock I had only done 9 articles, and it seemed hopeless for me to attempt to catch my train. I was feeling drowsy and stupid, partly from my dinner, and also from the effects of a long day's work. A cup of coffee would clear my brain. A commissionaire remains all night in a little lodge at the foot of the stairs, and is in the habit of making coffee at his spirit lamp, for any of the officials who may be working overtime. I rang the bell, therefore, to summon him. To my surprise, it was a woman who answered the summons, a large, coarse-faced elderly woman in an apron. She explained that she was the commissionnaire's wife, who did the chairing. Interesting word, and I gave her the order for the coffee. I wrote 2 more articles, and then, feeling more drowsy than ever, I rose and walked up and down the room and stretched my legs. My coffee had not yet come, and I wondered what the cause of the delay could be. Opening the door, I started down the corridor to find out. There was a straight passage, dimly lighted, which led from the room in which I had been working, and was the only exit from it. It ended in a curving staircase with the commissionnaire's lodge in the passage at the bottom. Halfway down this passage, in a small landing with another passage running into it at right angles. This second one leads, by means of a second small stair, to a side door used by servants, and also as a short-cut by clerks when coming from Charles Street. Here is a rough chart for the place. "Thank you. I think that I quite follow you," said Sherlock Holmes. "It is of the utmost importance that you should notice this point. I went down the stairs and into the hall, where I found the commissionaire fast asleep in his box, with the kettle boiling furiously upon the spirit lamp, for the water was spurting over the floor. Then I put out my hand and was about to shake the man, who was still sleeping soundly, when a bell over his head rang loudly, and he woke with a start. "Mr. Phelps, sir," said he, looking at me in bewilderment. "I came down to see if my coffee was ready. I was boiling the kettle when I fell asleep, sir." He looked at me, and then up at the still quivering bell, with an ever-growing astonishment upon his face. "If you was here, sir, then who rang the bell?" he asked. "The bell?" I said. "What bell is it?" "It's the bell of the room you were working in." A cold hand seemed to close round my heart. Someone was in that room where my precious treaty lay upon the table. I ran frantically up the stairs and along the passage. There was no one in the corridors, Mr. Holmes. There was no one in the room where all was exactly as I left it, save only that the papers committed to my case had been taken from the desk on which they lay. The copy was there, and the original was gone. Holmes sat up in his chair and rubbed his hands. I could see that the problem was entirely to his heart. "Pray, what did you do then?" he murmured. I recognized in an instant that the thief must have come up the stairs from the side door. Of course, I must have met him if he had come the other way. "You were satisfied that he could not have been concealed in the room all the time, or in the corridor which you have just described as dimly lighted? It is absolutely impossible. A rat could not conceal himself either in the room or the corridor. There is no cover at all. Thank you. Pray proceed. The commissionaire, seeing by my pale face that something was to be feared, had followed me upstairs. Now we both rushed along the corridor and down the steep steps which led to Charles Street. The door at the bottom was closed but unlocked. We flung it open and rushed out. I can distinctly remember that as we did so there came 3 chimes from a neighboring church. It was 10:15. "That is of enormous importance," said Holmes, making a note upon his shirt cuff. The night was very dark, and a thin, warm rain was falling. There was no one in Charles Street, but a great traffic was going on, as usual, in Whitehall at the extremity. We rushed along the pavement, bareheaded as we were, and at the far corner we found a policeman standing. "A robbery has been committed," I gasped. "A document of immense value has been stolen from the Foreign Office. Has anyone passed this way?" "I've been standing here for 1/4 hour, sir," said he. "Only one person has passed during that time, a woman, tall and elderly, with a Paisley shawl." "Ah, that is only my wife," cried the commissionaire. "Has no one else passed?" "No one." "Then it must be the other way that the thief took," cried the fellow, tugging at my sleeve. But I was not satisfied, and the attempts which he made to draw me away increased my suspicions. "Which way did the woman go?" I cried. "I don't know, sir. I noticed her pass, but I had no special reason for watching her. She seemed to be in a hurry." "How long ago was it?" "Oh, not very few minutes." "Within the last 5? "Well, it could not have been more than 5. "You're only wasting your time, sir, and every minute now is of importance," cried the commissionaire. "Take my word for it that my old woman has nothing to do with it, and come down to the other end of the street." "Well, if you won't, I will." And with that he rushed off in the other direction. But I was after him in an instant and caught him by the sleeve. "Where do you live?" said I. "Number 16 Ivy Lane, Brixton," he answered. "But don't let yourself be drawn away upon a false scent, Mr. Phelps. Come to the other end of the street and let us see if we can hear of anything." Nothing was to be lost by following his advice. With the policemen we both hurried down, but only to find the street full of traffic, many people coming and going, but all only too eager to get to the place of safety upon so wet a night. There was no lounger who could tell us who had passed. Then we returned to the office and searched the stairs and the passage without result. The corridor which led to the room was laid down with a kind of creamy linoleum which shows an impression very easily. We examined it very carefully, but found no outline of any footmark. Had it been raining all evening? Since about 7. How is it, then, that the woman who came into the room about 9 left no traces with her muddy boots? I am glad that you raised the point. It occurred to me at the time. The charwomen are in the habit of taking off their boots at the commissionnaire's office and putting on list slippers. Interesting. That is very clear. There were no marks then, though the night was a wet one. The chain of events is... sorry about this. The chain of events is certainly one of extraordinary interest. What did you do next? We examined the room also. There is no possibility of a secret door, and the windows are quite 30 feet from the ground. Both of them were fastened on the inside. The carpet prevents any possibility of a trap door, and the ceiling is of the ordinary whitewashed kind. I will pledge my life that whoever stole my papers could only have come through the door. How about the fireplace? They use none. There is a store. The bell rope hangs from the wire just to the right of my desk. Whoever rang it must have come up to the desk to do it. But why should any criminal wish to ring the bell? It is a most insoluble mystery. Certainly the incident was unusual. What were your next steps? You examined the room, I presume, to see that the intruder had left any traces. Any cigar end, or dropped glove, or hairpin, or other trifle? There was nothing of the sort. No smell? Well, we never thought of that. The scent of tobacco would have been worth a great deal to us in such an investigation. I never smoked myself, so I think I should have observed it if there had been any smell of tobacco. There was absolutely no clue of any kind. The only tangible fact was that the commissionaire's wife, Mrs. Tangy was the name, had hurried out of the place. He could give no explanation, save that it was about time when the women always went home. The policeman and I agreed that our best plan would be to seize the woman before she could get rid of the papers, presuming that she had them. The alarm had reached Scotland Yard by this time, and Mr. Forbes, the detective, came round at once and took up the case with a great deal of energy. We hired a hansom. In half an hour we were at the address which had been given to us. A young woman opened the door, who proved to be Mrs. Tangy's eldest daughter. Her mother had not come back yet, and we were shown into the front room to wait. About 10 minutes later a knock came at the door, and here we made the one serious mistake for which I blame myself. Instead of opening the door ourselves, we allowed the girl to do so. We heard her say, "Mother, there are 2 men in the house waiting to see you." And an instant afterward we heard the patter of feet rushing down the passage. Forbes flung open the door, and we both ran into the back room or kitchen, but the woman had got there before us. She stared at us with defiant eyes, and then suddenly recognized me. An expression of absolute astonishment came over her face. "Why, if it isn't Mr. Phelps of the office," she cried. Come, who did you think we were when you ran away from us?" asked my companion. "I thought you were the brokers," said she. "We've had some troubles with a tradesman." "That's not quite good enough," answered Forbes. "We have reason to believe that you have taken a paper of importance from the Foreign Office, and that you ran in here to dispose of it. You must come back with us to Scotland Yard to be searched." It was in vain that she protested and resisted. A 4-wheeler was brought, and we all 3 drove back in it. We had first made an examination of the kitchen, and especially of the kitchen fire, to see whether she might have made way with the papers during the instant that she was alone. There were no signs, however, of any ashes or scraps. Then we reached Scotland Yard. She was handed over at once to the female searcher. I waited in agony of suspense until she came back with her report. There were no signs of the papers. Then, for the first time, the horror of my situation in this full force came upon me. Hitherto I had been acting, and action had numbed thought. I had been so confident of regaining the treaty at once that I had not dared to think what would be the consequence if I had failed to do so. But now there was nothing more to be done, and I had leisure to realize my position. It was horrible. Watson there would tell you that I was a nervous, sensitive boy at school. It is my nature. I thought of my uncle and of his colleagues in the cabinet, of the shame which I had brought upon him, upon myself, upon everyone connected with me. What though I was the victim of an extraordinary accident? No allowance is made for accidents when diplomatic interests are at stake. I was ruined, shamefully, hopelessly ruined. I don't know what I did. I fancy I must have made a scene. I have a dim recollection of a group of officials who crowded round me, endeavoring to soothe me. One of them drove down with me to Waterloo and saw me into the Woking train. I believe that he would have come all the way had it not been that Dr. Ferrier, who lived near me, was going down by that very train. The doctor most kindly took charge of me, and it was well he did so, for I had a fit in the station, and before he reached home I was practically a raving maniac. You can imagine the state of things here when we were roused from our beds by the doctor's ringing, and found me in this condition. Poor Annie here and my mother were broken-hearted. Dr. Ferrier had just heard enough from the detective at the station to be able to give an idea of what had happened, and his story did not mend matters. It was evident to all that I was in for a long illness, so Joseph was bundled out of his cheery bedroom, and it was turned into a sick room for me. Here I have lain, Mr. Holmes, for over 9 weeks, unconscious and raving with brain fever. If it had not been for Miss Harrison here, and for the doctor's care, I should not be speaking to you now. She has She has nursed me by day and a hired nurse has looked after me by night, for in my mad fits I was capable of anything. Slowly my reason is cleared, but it is only during the last 3 days that my memory has quite returned. Sometimes I wish that it never had. The first thing that I did was to write to Mr. Forbes, who had the case in hand. He came out and assured me that, though everything had been done, no trace of a clue has been discovered. The commissionaire and his wife have been examined in every way without any light being thrown upon the matter. The suspicions of the police then rested upon young Goriot, who, as you may remember, stayed overtime in the office that night. His remaining behind and his French name were really the only 2 points which could suggest suspicion. But as a matter of fact, I did not begin work until he had gone, and his people are of Huguenot extraction, but as English in sympathy and tradition as you and I are. Oh, goodness, that is a twisty sentence. Nothing was found to implicate him in any way, and there the matter dropped. I turn to you, Mr. Holmes, as absolutely my last hope. If you fail me, then my honor as well as my position are forever forfeited. The invalid sank back into his cushions, tired out by his long recital, while his nurse poured him out a glass of some stimulating medicine. Holmes was sat silently, with his head thrown back and his eyes closed in an attitude which might seem listless to a stranger, but which I knew betokened the most intense absorption. "Your statement has been so explicit," said he at last, "that you have really left me very few questions to ask. There is one of the very utmost importance, however. Did you tell anyone that you had this special task to perform?" "No one." "Not Mr. Harrison here, for example?" "No, I had not been back to Woking between getting the order and executing the commission." "And none of your people had by chance been to see you?" "None." "Did any of them know their way about in the office?" "Oh, yes, all of them had been shown over it." "Still, of course, if you had said nothing to any one of the if you said nothing to anyone about the treaty, these inquiries are irrelevant." "I said nothing." "Do you know anything of the commissionaire?" "Nothing except that he is an old soldier." "What regiment?" "Oh, I've heard, Coldstream Guards." "Thank you. I have no doubt I can get details from Forbes. The authorities are excellent at amassing facts, though they do not always use them to advantage. What a lovely thing a rose is." He walked past the couch to the open window and held up the drooping stalk of a moss rose, looking down at the dainty blend of crimson and green. It was a new phase of his character to me, for I had never before seen him show any keen interest in natural objects. "There is nothing in which deduction is so necessary as in religion," said he, leaning back his head against the shutters. "It can be built up as an exact science by the reasoner. Our highest assurance of the goodness of Providence seems to me to rest in the flowers. All other things, our powers, our desires, our foods, are really necessary for our existence in the first instance. But this rose is an extra. Its smells and its color are an embellishment of life, not a condition of it. It is only goodness which gives extras, and so I say again that we have much to hope from the flowers." Percy Phelps and his nurse looked at Holmes during this demonstration with surprise and a good deal of disappointment written upon their faces. He had fallen into a reverie with the moss rose between his fingers. It had lasted some minutes before the young lady broke in upon it. "Do you see any prospect of solving this mystery, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, with a touch of asperity to her voice. "Ah, the mystery," he answered, coming back with a start to the realities of life. "Well, it would be absurd to deny that the case is a very obtuse and complicated one, but I can promise you that I will look into the matter and let you know any points which may strike me." "Do you see any clue?" You have furnished me with 7, but of course I must test them before I can pronounce them their value. You suspect someone. I suspect myself. What? Of coming to conclusions too rapidly. Then go to London and test your conclusions. Your advice is very excellent, Miss Harrison, said Holmes, rising. I think, Watson, we cannot do better. Do not allow yourself to indulge in false hopes, Mr. Phelps. The affair is a very tangled one. I shall be in fever until I see you again, cried the diplomatist. Well, I'll come out with the same train tomorrow, though it's more than likely that my report will be a negative one. God bless you for promising to come, cried our client. It gives me fresh life to know that something is being done. By the way, I have had a letter from Lord Holdhurst. What? What did he say? He was cold, but not harsh. I dare say my severe illness prevented him from being that. He repeated that the matter was of the utmost importance, and added that no steps would be taken about my future, by which he means, of course, my dismissal, until my health was restored, and I had an opportunity of repairing my misfortune. Well, that was reasonable and considerate, said Holmes. Come, Watson, for we have a good day's work before us in town. These allergies, my goodness. Mr. Joseph Harrison drove us down to the station, and we were soon whirling up in the Portsmouth train. Holmes was sunk in profound thought, and hardly opened his mouth until we passed Clapham Junction. It is a very cheering thing to come into London by any of these lines which run high and allow you to look down upon the houses like that. I thought he was joking, for the view was sordid enough, but he soon explained himself. Look at those big isolated clumps of buildings rising above the slates, like brick islands in the lead-colored sea. The board schools. Lighthouses, my boy, beacons of the future, capsules with hundreds of bright little seeds in each, one of which will spring the wiser, better England of the future. I suppose that man Phelps does not drink? I should not think so, nor should I. But we are bound to take every possibility into account. The poor devil has certainly got himself into very hot water, and it's a question whether we shall ever be able to get him ashore. What did you think of Miss Harrison? A girl of strong character. Yes, but she is a good sort, or I am mistaken. She and her brother are the only children of an ironmaster somewhere up Northumberland way. He got engaged to her when travelling last winter, and she came down to be introduced to his people with her brother as escort. Then came the smash, and she stayed on to nurse her lover, while her brother Joseph, finding himself pretty snug, stayed on too. I've been making a few independent inquiries, you see, but today must be a day of inquiries. My practice, I began. Oh, if you find your own cases more interesting than mine, said Holmes with some asperity. I was going to say that my practice could get along very well for a day or two, since it is of the slackest time in the year. Excellent, said he, recovering his good humor. Then we'll look into this matter together. I think that we should begin by seeing Forbes. We can hardly tell us all the details we want until we know from what side the case is to be approached. You said you have a clue. Well, we have several, but we can only test their value by further inquiry. The most difficult crime to track is the one which is purposeless. Now this is not purposeless. Who is to say that, who is it that profits by it? Hang on. Pages are stuck together. There is the French ambassador. There is the Russian. There is whoever might sell it to either of these. And there is Lord Holdhurst. Lord Holdhurst. Well, it is just conceivable that a statesman might find himself in a position where he was not sorry to have such a document accidentally destroyed. Not a statesman with the honorable record of Lord Holdhurst. It is a possibility, and we cannot afford to disregard it. We shall see the noble lord today, and find out if he can tell us anything. Meanwhile, I have already set inquiries upon foot." "Already?" "Yes, I sent wires from Woking Station to every evening paper in London. This advertisement will appear in each of them." He handed over a sheet torn from a notebook. On it was scribbled in pencil, £10 reward, the number of the cab which dropped a fare at or about the door of the Foreign Office in Charles Street at 9:45 in the evening of May 23rd. Apply 221B Baker Street. "You are confident that the thief came in a cab?" "If not, there is no harm done. But if Mr. Phelps is correct in stating that there is no hiding place either in the room or the corridors, then the person must have come from outside. If he came from outside on so wet a night, and yet left no trace of damp upon the linoleum, which was examined within a few minutes of his passing, then it was exceedingly probable that he came in a cab. Yes, I think that we may safely deduce a cab." "It sounds plausible." "It is one of the clues of which I spoke. It may lead us to something. And then, of course, there is the bell, which is the most distinctive feature of the case. Why should the bell ring? Was it the thief that did it, or out of bravado? Or was it someone who was with the thief who did it in order to prevent the crime? Or was it an accident? Or was it—" He sank back into the state of intense and silent thought from which he had emerged, but it seemed to me, accustomed as I was to his every mood, that some new possibility had dawned suddenly upon him. It was 3:20 when we reached our terminus, and after a hasty luncheon at the buffet, we pushed on at once to Scotland Yard. Holmes had already wired to Forbes, and we found him waiting to receive us, a small, foxy man with a sharp but by no means amiable expression. He was decidedly frigid in his manner to us, especially when he heard the errand upon which we had come. "I've heard of your methods before now, Mr. Holmes," he said tartly. "You are ready enough to use all the information that the police can lay at your disposal, and then you try to finish the case yourself and bring discredit upon them." "On the contrary," said Holmes, "out of my last 53 cases my name has only appeared in 4, and the police have had all the credit in 49. I don't blame you for not knowing this, for you are young and inexperienced. But if you wish to get on in your new duties, you will work with me, and not against me." "I'd be very glad of a hint or two," said the detective, changing his manner. "I've certainly had no credit from the case so far." "What steps have you taken?" "Tangi, the commissionaire, has been shadowed. He left the guards with a good character, and we can find nothing against him. His wife is a bad lot, though. I fancy she knows more about this than appears." "Have you shadowed her?" "We have set one of our women on to her. Mrs. Tangi drinks, and our woman has been with her twice when she was well on, but she could get nothing out of her." "I understand that they have had brokers in the house." "Yes, but they were paid off." "Where did the money come from?" "That one's all right. His pension was due. They have not shown any sign of being in funds." "What explanation did she give you of having answered the bell when Mr. Phelps rang for the coffee?" "She said that her husband was very tired and she wished to relieve him." "Well, certainly that would agree with his being found a little later sleeping in his chair. But there is something against him then, but there is nothing against them then, but the woman's character. Did you ask her why she hurried away that night? Her haste attracted the attention of the police constable." "She was later than usual and wanted to get home." "Did you point out to her that you and Mr. Phelps, who started at least 20 minutes after her, got home before her?" "She explained that by the difference between a bus and a hansom." "Did she make it clear why, on reaching her house, that she ran into the back kitchen?" "Because she had the money there with which to pay off the brokers." "She has had at least an answer for everything. Did you ask her whether in leaving she met anyone or saw anyone loitering about Charles Street?" "She saw no one but the constable." "Well, you seem to have cross-examined her pretty thoroughly. What else have you done?" The clerk Garot has been shadowed all these 9 weeks, but without result. We can show nothing against him. Anything else? Well, we have nothing else to go upon, no evidence of any kind. Have you formed any theory about how that bell rang? Well, I must confess that it beats me. It was a cool hand, whoever it was, to go and give the alarm like that. Yes, it was a queer thing to do. Many thanks to you for what you have told me. If I can put the man into your hands, you shall hear from me. Come along, Watson. Where are we going to now? I asked as we left the office. We are going to interview Lord Holdhurst, the cabinet member and future Premier of England. And this is the continuation of this story, The Adventure of the Naval Treaty. We were fortunate in finding that Lord Holdhurst was still in his chambers at Downing Street, and on Holmes sending in his card, we were instantly shown up. The statesman received us with that old-fashioned courtesy, for which he is remarkable, and seated us on the 2 luxurious easy-chairs on either side of the fireplace. Standing on the rug between us, with his slight, tall figure, his sharp-featured, thoughtful face, and his curling hair, prematurely tinged with gray, he seemed to represent that not too common type, a nobleman who is in truth noble. Your name is very familiar to me, Mr. Holmes, said he, smiling, and of course I cannot pretend to be ignorant of the course of your visit. There has only been one occurrence in these offices which could call for your attention. In whose interest are you acting, may I ask? In that of Mr. Percy Phelps, answered Holmes. Ah, my unfortunate nephew, you can understand that our kinship makes it the more impossible for me to screen him in any way. I fear that the incident must have been a very prejudicial effect upon his career. But if the document is found, that, of course, would be different. I had 1 or 2 questions which I wished to ask you, Lord Holdhurst. Shall be happy to give you any information in my power. Was it in this room that you gave your instructions to the copying of the document? It was. Then you could hardly have been overheard. It is out of the question. Did you ever mention to anyone that it was your intention to give out the treaty to be copied? Never. Are you certain of that? Absolutely. Well, since you never said so, and Mr. Phelps never said so, and nobody else knew anything of the matter, then the thief's presence in the room was purely accidental. He saw his chance and he took it. The statesman smiled. You take me out of my providence there, said he. Holmes considered for a moment. There is another very important point which I wish to discuss with you, said he. You feared, as I understand, that very grave results might follow from the details of this treaty becoming known. A shadow passed over the expressive face of the statesman. Very grave results indeed. And have they occurred? Not yet. If the treaty had been reached, let us say, the French or Russian Foreign Office, you would expect to hear of it? I should, said Lord Holdhurst with a wry face. Since nearly 10 weeks have elapsed then, and nothing has been heard, it is not unfair to suppose that for some reason the treaty has not reached them. Lord Holdhurst shrugged his shoulders. We can hardly suppose, Mr. Holmes, that the thief took the treaty in order to frame it and hang it up. Perhaps it is waiting for a better price. If he waits a little longer, he will get no price at all. The treaty will cease to be secret in a few months. That is most important, said Holmes. Of course, it is a possible supposition that the thief has had a sudden illness, an attack of brain fever, for example, asked the statesman, flashing a swift glance at him. I did not say so, said Holmes imperturbably. And now, Lord Holdhurst, we have taken already too much of your valuable time, and we shall wish you good day. Every success to your investigation, be the criminal who it may, answered the nobleman, as he bowed us out of the door. He's a fine fellow, said Holmes, as we came out into the Whitehall. But he has a struggle to keep up his position. He is far from rich and has many calls. You noticed, of course, that his boots have been resoled. Now, Watson, I won't detain you from your legitimate work any longer. I shall do nothing more today unless I have an answer to my cab advertisement. But I should be extremely obliged to you if you would come down with me to Woking tomorrow by the same train which we took today. I met him accordingly next morning, and we travelled down to Woking together. He had had no answer to his advertisement, he said, and no fresh light had been thrown upon the case. He had, when he so willed it, the utter immobility of countenance of a Red Indian, and I could not gather from his appearance whether he was satisfied or not with the position of the case. His conversation, I remember, was about the Bertillon system of measurement, and he expressed his enthusiastic admiration of the French savant. We found our client still under the charge of his devoted nurse, but looking considerably better than before. He rose from the sofa and greeted us without difficulty when we entered. "Any news?" he asked eagerly. "My report, as I expected, is a negative one," said Holmes. "I have seen Forbes, and I have seen your uncle, and I have set one or two trains of inquiry upon foot, which may lead to something." "You have not lost heart, then?" "By no means." "God bless you for saying that," cried Mr. Harrison. "If we keep our courage and our patience, the truth must come out." "We have more to tell you than you have for us," said Phelps, reseating himself upon the couch. "I hoped you might have something. Yes, we have had an adventure during the night, and one which might have proved to be a serious one." His expression grew very grave as he spoke, and a look of something akin to fear sprang up in his eyes. "Do you know," said he, "that I begin to believe that I am the unconscious center of some monstrous conspiracy, and that my life is aimed at as well as my honor?" "Ah!" cried Holmes. "It sounds incredible, for I have not, as far as I know, any enemy in the world. But from last night's experience I can come to no other conclusions." "Pray, let me hear it." "You must know that last night was the very first night that I have ever slept without a nurse in the room. I was so much better that I thought I could dispense with one. I had a night light burning, however. Well, about 2 in the morning I had sunk into a light sleep, when I was suddenly aroused by a slight noise. It was like the sound which a mouse makes when it is gnawing a plank, and I lay listening to it for some time under the impression that it must come from that cause. Then it grew louder, and suddenly there came from the window a sharp metallic snick. I sat up in amazement. There could be no doubt that what the sounds were now. The faint ones had been caused by someone forcing an instrument through the slit between the sashes, and the second by the catch being pressed back. There was a pause then for about 10 minutes, as if the person were waiting to see whether the noise had awoken me. Then I heard a gentle creaking as the window was very slowly opened. I could stand it no longer, for my nerves were not what they used to be. I sprang out of bed and flung open the shutters. A man was crouching at the window. I could see little of him, for he was gone like a flash. He was wrapped in some sort of cloak, which came across the lower part of his face. One thing only I am sure of, and that is that he had some weapon in his hand. It looked to me like a long knife. I distinctly saw the gleam of it as he turned to run. "This is most interesting," said Holmes. "Pray, what did you do then?" "I should have followed him through the open window if I had been stronger. As it was, I rang the bell and roused the house. It took me some little time, for the bell rings in the kitchen, and the servants all sleep upstairs. I shouted, however, and that brought Joseph down, and he roused the others. Joseph and the groom found marks on the flower beds outside the window, but the weather has been so dry lately that they found it hopeless to follow the trail across the grass. There is a place, however, on the wooden fence which skirts the road, which shows signs, they tell me, as if someone had got over and had snapped the top of the rail in doing so. I have said nothing to the local police yet, for I thought I had best have your opinion first." This tale of our client's of our clients appeared to have an extraordinary effect on Sherlock Holmes. He rose from his chair and paced about the room in uncontrollable excitement. "Misfortunes never come singly," said Phelps, smiling, though it was evident that his adventure had somewhat shaken him. "You have certainly had your share," said Holmes. "Do you think you could walk round the house with me?" "Oh, yes, I should like a little sunshine. Joseph will come too." "And I also," said Miss Harrison. "I am afraid not," said Holmes, shaking his head. "I think I must ask you to remain sitting exactly where you are." The young lady resumed her seat with an air of displeasure. Her brother, however, had joined us, and we set off all four together. We passed round the lawn to the outside of the young diplomatist's window. There were, as he had said, marks upon the flower bed, but they were hopelessly blurred and vague. Holmes stooped over them for an instant, and then rose, shrugging his shoulders. "I don't think anyone could make much of this," said he. "Let us go round the house and see why this particular room was chosen by the burglar. I should have thought those larger windows of the drawing-room and dining-room would have had more attractions for them." "They are more visible from the road," suggested Joseph Harrison. "Ah, yes, of course. There is a door there that he might have attempted." "What is it for?" "It is the side entrance for tradespeople. Of course it is locked at night." "Have you ever had an alarm like this before?" "Never," said our client. "Do you keep plate in the house, or anything to attract burglars?" "Nothing of value." Holmes strolled round the house with his hands in his pockets in a negligent air which was unusual for him. "By the way," said he to Joseph Harrison, "you found some place, I understand, where the fellow scaled the fence. Let us have a look at that." The plump young man led us to the spot where the top of one of the wooden rails had been cracked. A small fragment of the wood was hanging down. Holmes pulled it off and examined it critically. "Do you think that was done last night? Looks rather old, does it not?" "Well, possibly so." "There are no marks of anyone jumping down upon the other side. No, I fancy we shall get no help here. Let us go back to the bedroom and talk the matter over." Percy Phelps was walking very slowly, leaning upon the arm of his future brother-in-law. Holmes walked swiftly across the lawn, and we were at the open window of the bedroom long before the others came up. "Miss Harrison," said Holmes, speaking with the utmost intensity of manner, "you must stay where you are all day. Let nothing prevent you from staying where you are all day. It is of the utmost importance." "Certainly, if you wish it, Mr. Holmes," said the girl in astonishment. "When you go to bed, lock the door of this room on the outside and keep the key. Promise to do this." "But Percy—" "You will come to London with us." "And I am to remain here?" "It is for his sake. You can serve him. Quick! Promise!" She gave a quick nod of assent just as the other two came up. "Why do you sit moping there, Annie?" cried her brother. "Come out into the sunshine." "No, thank you, Joseph. I have a slight headache, and this room is deliciously cool and soothing." "What do you propose now, Mr. Holmes?" asked our client. "Well, in investigating this minor affair, we must not lose sight of our main inquiry. It would be a very great help to me if you would come up to London with us." "At once?" "Well, as soon as you conveniently can. Say in an hour." "I feel quite strong enough if I can really be of any help." "The greatest possible." "Perhaps you would like me to stay there tonight?" "I was just going to propose it." "Then if my friend of the night comes to revisit me, he will find the bird flown. We are all in your hands, Mr. Holmes, and you must tell us exactly what you would like done. Perhaps you would prefer that Joseph came with us, so as to look after me." "Oh, no, my friend Watson is a medical man, you know, and he'll look after you. We'll have our lunch here, if you will permit us, and then we shall all three set out for town together." It was arranged as he suggested, though Miss Harrison excused herself from leaving the bedroom, in accordance with Holmes' suggestion. What the object of my friend's maneuvers was, I could not conceive, unless it was to keep the lady away from Phelps, who, rejoiced by his returning health and by the prospect or action, lunched with us in the dining room. Holmes had a still more startling surprise for us, however, for after accompanying us down to the station and seeing us into our carriage, he calmly announced that he had no intention of leaving Woking. "There are one or two small points which I should desire to clear up before I go," said he. "Your absence, Mr. Phelps, will in some way rather assist me. Watson, when you reach London, you would oblige me by driving at once to Baker Street with our friend here, and remaining with him until I see you again. It is fortunate that you are old schoolfellows, as you must have much to talk over. Mr. Phelps can have the spare bedroom tonight, and I will be with you in time for breakfast, for there is a train which will take me into Waterloo at 8. "But how about our investigation in London?" asked Phelps ruefully. "We can do that tomorrow. I think that just at present I can be of more immediate use here." You might tell them at Briarbrae that I hope to be back tomorrow night," cried Phelps as he began to move from the platform. "I hardly expect to go back to Briarbrae," answered Holmes, and he waved his hand to us cheerily as we shot out from the station. Phelps and I talked it over on our journey, but neither of us could devise a satisfactory reason for this new development. "I suppose he wants to find out some clue as to the burglary last night, if a burglar it was. For myself, I don't believe it was an ordinary thief." "What is your own idea, then?" "'Pon my word, you may put it down to my weak nerves or not, but I believe there is some deep political intrigue going on round me, and that for some reason that passes my understanding, my life is aimed at by the conspirators. It sounds high-flown and absurd, but consider the facts. Why should a thief try to break in at a bedroom window, where there could be no hopes of any plunder? And why should he come with a long knife in his hands?" You are sure it was not a housebreaker's jemmy?" "Oh, no, it was a knife. I saw the flash of the blade quite distinctly." "But why on earth should you be pursued with such animosity?" "That is a question. Well, if Holmes takes the same view, that would account for his actions, would it not? Presuming that your theory is correct, if he can lay his hands upon the man who threatened you last night, he will have gone a long ways towards finding who took the naval treaty. It is absurd to suppose that you have two enemies, one of whom robs you, the other who threatens your life." "But Mr. Holmes said that he was not going back to Briarbrae." "I have known him for some time," said I, "but I never knew him to do anything yet without a very good reason." And with that our conversations drifted off into other topics. But it was a weary day for me. Phelps was still weak after his long illness, and his misfortunes made him querulous and nervous. In vain I endeavored to interest him in Afghanistan, in India, in social questions, in anything which might take his mind out of the groove. He would always come back to his lost treaty, wondering, guessing, speculating as to what Holmes was doing, what steps Lord Holdhurst was taking, what news we should have in the morning. As the evening wore on, his excitement became quite painful. "You have explicit faith in Holmes?" he asked. "I have seen him do some remarkable things, but he never brought light into anything quite so dark as this." "Oh, yes, I have known him solve questions which presented fewer clues than yours." "But not where such interests are at stake." "I don't know that. To my certain knowledge, he has acted on behalf of 3 of the reigning houses of Europe in very vital matters." "But who knows him well, Watson? He is such but you know him well, Watson. He is such an inscrutable fellow that I never quite know what to make of him. Do you think he is hopeful? Do you think he expects to make a success of it?" "He has said nothing." "That is a bad sign." "On the contrary, I have noticed that when he is off the trail, he generally says so. It is when he is on a scent and is not quite absolutely sure yet that it is the right one that he is most taciturn. Now, my dear fellow, we can't help matters by making ourselves nervous about them. So let me implore you to go to bed, and so be fresh for whatever may await us tomorrow." I was able at last to persuade my companion to take my advice, though I knew from his excited manner that there was not much hope for sleep for him. Indeed, his mood was infectious, for I lay tossing half the night myself, brooding over this strange problem and preventing 100 theories, each of which was more impossible than the last. Why had Holmes remained at Woking? Why had he asked Miss Harrison to remain in the sick-room all day? Why had he been so careful not to inform the people at Briarbrae that he intended to remain near them? I cudgelled my brain until I fell asleep in the endeavour to find some explanation which would cover all these facts. It was 7 o'clock when I awoke, and I set off at once for Phelps's room, to find him haggard and spent after the sleepless night. His first question was whether Holmes had arrived yet. "He'll be here when he promised," said I, "and not an instant sooner or later." And my words were true, for shortly after 8 a hansom dashed up to the door, and our friend got out of it. Standing in the window, we saw that his left hand was swathed in a bandage, and that his face was very grim and pale. He entered the house, but it was some little time before he came upstairs. "He looks like a beaten man," cried Phelps. I was forced to confess that he was right. "After all," said I, the clues of the matter lies probably here in town." Phelps gave a groan. "I don't know how it is," said he, "but I had hoped for so much from this return. But surely his hand was not tied up like that yesterday. What can be the matter?" "You were not wounded, Holmes?" I asked as my friend entered the room. "Tut, it is only a scratch through my own clumsiness," he answered, nodding his good morning to us. "This case of yours, Mr. Phelps, is certainly one of the darkest which I have ever investigated. I feared that you would find it beyond you. It has been most remarkable experience." "That bandage tells of adventures," said I. "Won't you tell us what happened?" "After breakfast, my dear Watson. Remember that I have breathed 30 miles of Surrey air this morning. I suppose there has been no answer from my cabman's advertisement? Well, well, we cannot expect to score every time." The table was all laid, and, just as I was about to ring, Mrs. Hudson entered with the tea and coffee. A few minutes later she brought in 3 covers, and we all drew up to the table. Holmes ravenous, I curious, and Phelps in the gloomiest state of depression. "Mrs. Hudson has risen to the occasion," said Holmes, uncovering a dish of curried chicken. "Her cuisine is a little limited, but she has as good an idea of breakfast as a Scotswoman. What have you there, Watson?" "Ham and eggs," I answered. "Good! What are you going to take, Mr. Phelps? Curried fowl or eggs, or will you help yourself?" "Thank you, I can eat nothing," said Phelps. "Oh, come, try the dish before you." "Thank you, I would really rather not." "Well, then," said Holmes, with a mischievous twinkle, "I suppose that you have no objection to helping me?" Phelps raised the cover, and as he did so, he uttered a scream and sat there staring with a face as white as the plate upon which he looked. Across the center of it was lying a little cylinder of blue-gray paper. He caught it up, devoured it with his eyes, and then danced madly about the room, pressing it to his bosom and shrieking out in his delight. Then he fell back into his armchair, so limp and exhausted with his own emotions that we had to pour brandy down his throat to keep him from fainting. "There, there," said Holmes soothingly, patting him upon the shoulder. "It is too bad to spring it on you like this, but Watson there will tell you that I can never resist a touch of the dramatic." Phelps seized his hand and kissed it. "God bless you!" he cried. "You have saved my honor." Well, my own was at stake, you know, said Holmes. I assure you it is just as hateful to me to fail in a case as it is to be, as it can be to you to blunder over commission. Phelps thrust away the precious document into the innermost pocket of his coat. I have not the heart to interrupt your breakfast any further, and yet I am dying to know how you got it and where it was. Sherlock Holmes swallowed a cup of coffee and turned his attention to the ham and eggs. Then he rose, lit his pipe, and settled himself down into his chair. I'll tell you what I did first, and how I came to do it afterwards, said he. After leaving you at the station, I went for a charming walk through some admirable Surrey scenery to a pretty little village called Ripley, where I had my tea at an inn, and took the precaution of filling my flask and putting a paper of sandwiches in my pocket. There I remained until evening, when I set off for Woking again, and found myself in the high road outside Briarbrae just after sunset. Well, I waited until the road was clear. It is never a very frequented one at any time, I fancy, and then I clambered over the fence into the grounds. Surely the gate was open, ejaculated Phelps. Yes, but I have a peculiar taste in these matters. I chose the place where the 3 fir trees stand, and behind their screen I got over without the least chance of anyone in the house being able to see me. I crouched down among the bushes on the other side, and crawled from one to the other, witness the disputable state of my trouser knees, until I had reached the clump of rhododendrons just opposite to your bedroom window. There I squatted down and awaited developments. The blind was not down in your room, and I could see Miss Harrison sitting there reading by the table. It was 10:15 when she closed her book, fastened the shutters, and retired. I heard her shut the door, and felt quite sure that she had turned the key in the lock. The key? Ejaculated Phelps. Yes, I had given Miss Harrison instructions to lock the door on the outside and take the key with her when she went to bed. She carried out every one of my injunctions to the letter, and certainly would, without her cooperation, you would not have your papers in your coat pocket. She departed then, and the lights went out, and I was left squatting in the rhododendron bush. The night was fine, but still it was a very weary vigil. Of course, it has the sort of excitement about it that the sportsman waits for the big game, but it was very long. It was very long, though, almost as long, Watson, as when you and I waited in that deadly room, when we looked into the little problem of the speckled band. There was a church clock down at Woking which struck the quarters, and I thought more than once that it had stopped. At last, however, about 2 in the morning, I suddenly heard the gentle song of a bolt being pushed back and the creaking of a key. A moment later the servants' door was opening, and Mr. Joseph Harrison stepped out into the moonlight. "Joseph!" ejaculated Phelps. He was bareheaded, but he had a black cloak thrown over his shoulders, and so that he could conceal his face in an instant, if there were any alarm. He walked on tiptoe under the shadow of the wall, and when he reached the window, he worked a long-bladed knife through the sash, and pushed back the catch. Then he flung open the window, and putting his knife through the crack in the shutters, he thrust the bar up and swung them open. From where I lay, I had a perfect view of the inside of the room and of every one of his movements. He lit the 2 candles, which stand upon the mantelpiece, and then he proceeded to turn back the corner of the carpet in the neighborhood of the door. Presently he stooped and picked out a square piece of board, which is surely left to enable the plumbers to get at the joints of the gas pipes. This one covered, as a matter of fact, the T-joint, which gives off the pipe which supplies the kitchen underneath. Out of this hiding place he drew that little cylinder of paper, pushed down the board, and walked straight into my arms as I stood waiting for him outside the window. Well, he was rather more vicious than I gave him credit for, was Master Joseph. He flew at me with his knife, and I had to grasp him twice and got a cut over the knuckles before I had the upper hand of him. He looked murder out of the only eye he could sea with when we had finished, but he listened to reason and gave up the papers. Having got them, I let my man go, but I wired full particulars to Forbes this morning. If he is quick enough to catch this bird, well and good. But if, as I shrewdly suspect, he finds the nest empty before he gets there, why, all the better for the government. I fancy that Lord Holdhurst, for one, and Mr. Percy Phelps, for another, would very much rather that the affair never got as far as a police court. "My God!" gasped our client. "Do you tell me that during these long 10 weeks of agony the stolen papers were within the very room with me all the time?" "So it was." "And Joseph! Joseph, a villain and a thief! I am afraid Joseph's character is a rather deeper and more dangerous one than one might judge from his appearance. For what I have heard from him this morning, I gather that he has lost heavily in dabbling with stocks, and that he is ready to do anything on earth or to better his fortunes. Being an absolutely selfish man, when a chance presented itself, he did not allow either his sister's happiness or your reputation to hold his hand." Percy Phelps sank back into his chair. "My head whirls," said he. "Your words have dazed me." "The principal difficulty in your case," remarked Holmes in his didactic fashion, "lay in the fact that there being too much evidence, what was vital was overlaid and hidden by what was irrelevant. Of all the facts which were presented to us, we had to pick just those which we deemed to be essential, and then place them together in their order, so as to construct this very remarkable chain of events. I had already begun to suspect Joseph from the fact that you had intended to travel home with him that night, and that therefore it was a likely enough thing that he should call for you, knowing the Foreign Office as well, upon his way. When I heard that someone had been so anxious to get into the bedroom in which no one but Joseph could have concealed anything, you told us in your narrative how you had turned Joseph out with you when you arrived with the doctor. My suspicions all changed to certainties, especially as the attempt was made on the first night upon which the nurse was absent, showing that the intruder was well acquainted with the ways of the house. How blind I have been! The facts of the case, as far as I have worked them out, are these. This Joseph Harrison entered the office through the Charles Street door, and knowing his way, he walked straight into your room the instant after you left it. Finding no one there, he promptly rang the bell, and at the instant that he did so, his eyes caught the paper upon the table. A glance showed him that chance had put in his way a state document of immense value, and in an instant he had thrust it into his pocket and was gone. A few minutes elapsed, as you may remember, before the sleepy commissionaire drew your attention to the bell, and those were just enough to give the thief time to make his escape. He made his way to Woking by the first train, and, having examined his booty and assured himself that it really was of immense value, he concealed it in what he thought was a very safe place, with the intention of taking it out again in a day or two, and carrying it to the French embassy, or, wherever he thought that a long price was to be had. Then came your sudden return. He, without a moment's warning, was bundled out of his room, and from that time onward there was always at least two of you there to prevent him from regaining his treasure. The situation to him must have been a maddening one, but at last he thought he saw his chance. He tried to steal in, but was baffled by your wakefulness. You may remember that you did not take your usual draught that night. I remember. I fancy that he has taken steps to make that draught efficacious, and that he was quite relied upon your being unconscious. Of course, I understand that he would repeat the attempt whenever it could have been done with safety. Your leaving the room gave him the chance he wanted. I kept Miss Harrison in all day, but that he might not anticipate us. Then, having given him the idea that the coast was clear, I kept guard as I have described. I already knew that the papers were probably in the room, but I had no desire to rip up all the planking and skirting in search of them. I let him take them, therefore, from the hiding-place, and so saved myself an infinity of trouble. Is there any other point which I can make clear? Why did he try the window on the first occasion, I asked, when he might have entered by the door? In reaching the door, he would have had to pass 7 bedrooms. On the other hand, he could get out on the lawn with ease. Anything else? You don't think, asked Phelps, that he had any murderous intentions? The knife was only meant as a tool? It may be so, answered Holmes, shrugging his shoulders. I can only say for certain that Mr. Joseph Harrison is a gentleman to whose mercy I should be extremely unwilling to trust. And we've come to the end of that story. That was a two-parter, so that was a bit of a surprise. But we won't go over that long. And just taking a very brief pause. All right. So now we are at adventure number 24, The Adventure of the Final Problem. It is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write the last words in which I shall ever record the singular gifts by which my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes was distinguished. In an incoherent and, as I deeply feel, an entirely inadequate fashion, I have endeavored to give some account of my strange experiences in his company, from the chance which first brought us together at the period of the study in scarlet, up to the time of his interference in the matter of the naval treaty. An interference which had the unquestionable effect of preventing a serious international complication. It was my intention to have stopped there, and to have said nothing of that event which has created a void in my life which the lapse of 2 years has done little to fill. My hand has been forced, however, by the recent letters in which Colonel James Moriarty defends the memory of his brother, and I have no choice but to lay the facts before the public exactly as they occurred. I alone know the absolute truth of the matter, and I am satisfied that the time has come when no good purpose is to be served by its suppression. As far as I know, there have been only 3 accounts in the public press. That in the Journal de Genève from May 6, 1891, the Reuters dispatch from the English paper upon May 7th, and finally the recent letters to which I have alluded. Of these, the first and second were extremely condensed, while the last is, as I shall now show, an absolute perversion of the facts. It lies with me to tell for the first time what really took place between Professor Moriarty and Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It may be remembered that after my marriage and my subsequent start in private practice, the very intimate relations which had existed between Holmes and myself became to some extent more modified. He still came to me from time to time when he desired a companion in his investigations, but these occasions grew more and more solemn, until I find that in the year 1890 there were only 3 cases of which I retain any record. During the winter of that year and the early spring of 1891, I saw in the papers that he had been engaged by the French government upon a matter of supreme importance, and I received 2 notes from Holmes, dating from Narbonne and from Nimes, I guess that's what it is, from which I gather that his stay in France was likely to be a long one. It was with some surprise, therefore, that I saw him walk into my consulting room upon the evening of the 24th of April. It struck me that he was looking even paler and thinner than usual. Yes, I have been using myself up rather too freely, he remarked in answer to my look rather than to my words. I have been a little pressed of late. Have you any objection to my closing your shutters? The only light in the room came from the lamp upon the chair in which I had been reading. Holmes edged his way round the wall, and flinging the shutters together, he bolted them securely. "You are afraid of something?" I asked. "Well, I am." "Of what?" "Of air guns." "My dear Holmes, what do you mean?" "I think that you know me well enough, Watson, to understand that I am by no means a nervous man. At the same time, it is stupidity rather than courage to refuse to respond, to recognize danger when it is close upon you. Might I trouble you for a match?" He drew in the smoke of his cigarette as he was He drew in the smoke of his cigarette as if the soothing influence was grateful to him. "I must apologize for calling so late," said he, "and I must further beg you to be so unconventional as to allow me to leave your house presently by scrambling over your back garden wall." "But what does it all mean?" I asked. He held out his hand, and I saw in the light of the lamp that 2 of his knuckles were burst and bleeding. "It's not an airy nothing, you see," said he, smiling. "On the contrary, it is solid enough for a man to break his hand over. Is Mrs. Watson in?" "She's away with a visit." "Indeed! You are alone?" "Quite." "Then it makes it the easier for me to propose that you should come away with me for a week on to the continent." "Where?" "Oh, anywhere. It's all the same to me." There was something very strange in all this. It was not Holmes' nature to take an aimless holiday, and something about his pale, worn face told me that his nerves were at their highest tension. He saw the question in my eyes, and, putting his fingertips together and his elbows upon his knees, he explained the situation. "You have probably never heard of Professor Moriarty," said he. "Never." "Aye, there's the genius and the wonder of the thing," he cried. "The man pervades London, and no one has heard of him. That's what puts him on a pinnacle in the records of crime. I tell you, Watson, in all seriousness, that if I could beat that man, if I could free society of him, I should feel that my own career had reached its summit, and I should be prepared to turn to some more placid line in life. Between ourselves, the recent cases in which I have been of assistance to the royal family of Scandinavia and to the French Republic have left me in such a position that I could continue to live in the quiet fashion which is most congenial to me, and to concentrate my attention upon my chemical researches. But I could not rest, Watson. I could not sit quiet in my chair if I thought that such a man as Professor Moriarty were walking the streets of London unchallenged." "What has he done, then?" "His career has been an extraordinary one. He is a man of good birth and excellent education, endowed by nature with a phenomenal mathematical faculty. At the age of 21 he wrote a treatise upon the binomial theorem, which he has had a European vogue. On the strength of it, he won the mathematical chair at one of our smaller universities, and had, to all appearances, a most brilliant career before him. But the man had hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran in his blood, which, instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. Dark rumors gathered round him in the university town, and eventually he was compelled to resign his chair and to come down to London, where he set up an army coach. So much is known to the world, but what I am telling you now is that I have myself discovered. As you are aware, Watson, there is no one who knows the higher criminal world of London as well as I do. For years past I have continually been conscious of some power behind the malefactor, some deep organizing power which forever stands in the way of the law and throws its shield over to the wrongdoer. Again and again, in cases of the most varying sort, forgery, cases, robberies, murders, I have felt the presence of this force, and I have deduced its action in many of those undiscovered crimes in which I have not been personally consulted. For years I have endeavored to break through the veil which shrouded it, and at last the time came when I seized my thread and followed it, until it led me, after 1,000 cunning windings, to ex-Professor Moriarty of mathematical celebrity. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson. He is the organizer of half that is evil and of nearly all that is undetected in this great city. He is a genius, a philosopher, an abstract thinker. He has a brain of the first order. He sits motionless like a spider in the center of his web, but that web has 1,000 radiations, and he knows every quiver of each of them. He does little himself, he only plans, but his agents are numerous and splendidly organized. Is there a crime to be done? A paper to be abstracted? We will say a house to be rifled, a man to be removed. The word is passed to the professor. The matter is organized and carried out. The agent may be caught. In that case, money is found for his bail, or his defense. But the central power which uses the agent is never caught, never so much as suspected. This was the organization which I deduced, Watson, and which I devoted my whole energy to exposing and breaking up. But the professor was fenced round with safeguards so cunningly devised that, do what I would, it seemed impossible to get evidence which could convict him in a court of law. You know my powers, my dear Watson, and yet at the end of 3 months I was forced to confess that I had at last met an antagonist who was my intellectual equal. My honor at his crimes was lost in my admiration of his my horror at his crimes was lost in my admiration of his skill. But at last he made a trip. Only a little trip, but it was more than he could afford when I was so close upon him. I had my chance, and, starting from that point, I have woven my net round him until now it is all ready to close. In 3 days, it is to say on Monday next, matters will be ripe, and the professor, with all the principal members of his gang, will be in the hands of the police. Then will come the greatest criminal trial of the century, and clearing up of over 40 mysteries, and the rope for all of them. But if we move at all prematurely, you understand, they may slip out of our hands, even at the last moment. Now, if I could have done this without the knowledge of Professor Moriarty, all would have been well, but he was too wily for that. He saw every step which I took to draw my toils round him. Again and again he strove to break away, but I as often headed him off. I tell you, my friend, that if a detailed account of that silent contest could be written, it would take its place as the most brilliant bit of thrust and parry work in the history of detection. Never had I risen to such a height, and never have I been so hard pressed by an opponent. He cut deep, and yet I always just undercut him. This morning the last steps were taken, and 3 days only were wanted to complete the business. I was sitting in my room thinking the matter over, when the door opened and Professor Moriarty stood before me. My nerves are fairly poor, Watson, but I must confess to a start when I saw the very man who had been so much in my thoughts standing there in my threshold. His appearance was quite familiar to me. He is extremely tall and thin. His forehead domes out in a white curve, and his 2 eyes are deeply sunken in his head. He is clean-shaven, pale, and ascetic-looking, retaining something of the professor in his features. His shoulders are rounded from much study, and his face protrudes forward, and is forever slowly oscillating from side to side in a curiously reptilian manner. He peers at me with great curiosity in his puckered eyes. "You have less frontal development than I should have expected," said he at last. "It is a dangerous habit to finger loaded firearms in the pocket of your own It is a dangerous habit to finger loaded firearms in the pocket of one's dressing gown. The fact is that upon his entrance I had instantly recognized the extreme personal danger in which I lay. The only conceivable escape for him lay in the silencing my tongue. In an instant I had slipped the revolver from the drawer into my pocket and was covering him through the cloth. At his remark I drew the weapon out and laid it cocked upon the table. He still smiled and blinked, but there was something about his eyes which made me feel very glad that I had it there. "You evidently don't know me," said he. "On the contrary," I answered, "I think it is fairly evident that I do. Pray take a chair. I can spare you 5 minutes if you have anything to say." "All that I have to say has already crossed your mind," said he. "Then possibly my answer has crossed yours," I replied. "You stand fast?" "Absolutely." He clapped his hand into his pocket, and I raised the pistol from the table, but he merely drew out a memorandum book in which he had scribbled some dates. "You crossed my path on the 4th of January," said he. "On the 23rd you incommoded me. By the middle of February I was seriously inconvenienced by you. At the end of March I was absolutely hampered in my plans, and now, at the close of April, I find myself placed in such a position, through your continual persecution, that I am in positive danger of losing my liberty. The situation is becoming an impossible one." "Have you any suggestion to make?" I asked. "You must drop it, Mr. Holmes," said he, swaying his face about. "You really must, you know." "After Monday," said I. "Tut, tut," said he. "I am quite sure that a man of your intelligence will see that there can be but one outcome to this affair. It is necessary that you should withdraw. You have worked things in such a fashion that we have only one resource left. It has been an intellectual treat to me to see the way in which you have grappled with this affair, and I say unaffectedly that it would be a grief to me to be forced to take any extreme measure. You smile, sir, but I assure you that it really would." "Danger is part of my trade," I remarked. "This is not danger," said he. "It is inevitable destruction. You stand in the way not merely of an individual, but of a mighty organization, the full extent of which you, with all your cleverness, have been unable to realize. You must stand clear, Mr. Holmes, or be trodden underfoot." "I am afraid," said I, rising, "that in the pleasure of this conversation I am neglecting business of importance which awaits me elsewhere." He rose also and looked at me in silence, shaking his head sadly. "Well, well," said he at last, "it seems a pity, but I have done what I could. I know every move of your game. You can do nothing before Monday. It has been a duel between you and me, Mr. Holmes. You hope to place me in the dock. I tell you that I will never stand in the dock. You hope to beat me. I tell you that you will never beat me. If you are clever enough to bring destruction upon me, rest assured that I shall do as much to you." "You have paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty," said I. "Let me pay you in return when I say that if I was assured of the former eventuality, I would, in the interest of the public, cheerfully accept the latter." "I can promise you the one, but not the other," he snarled, and so turned his rounded back upon me, and went peering and blinking out of the room. That was my singular interview with Professor Moriarty. I confess that it left an unpleasant effect upon my mind. His soft, precise fashion of speech leaves a conviction of singularity which a mere bully could not produce. Of course, you say, why not take police precautions against him? The reason is that I am well convinced that it is from his agents the blow would fall. I have the best of proofs that it would be so. "You have already been assaulted?" "My dear Watson, Professor Moriarty is not a man who lets the grass grow under his feet. I went out about midday to transact some business in Oxford Street. As I passed the corner which leads from Bentinck Street onto the Welbeck Street, crossing a 2-horse van furiously driven... As I passed the corner which leads from Bentinck Street onto the Welbeck Street, crossing a 2-horse van furiously driven... they don't use commas here, I'm sorry. As I was crossing, a 2-horse van furiously driven past whizzed round and was on me like a flash. I sprang for the footpath and saved myself by the fraction of a second. The van dashed round by Marylebone. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Wizard 101 has Marylebone, so that's what I was thinking. Marylebone Way, and was gone in an instant. I kept to the pavement after that, Watson, but as I walked down Vere Street, a brick came down from the roof of one of the houses and was shattered to fragments at my feet. I called the police and had the place examined. There were slates and bricks piled upon the roof, preparatory to some repairs, and they would have me believe that the wind had toppled over one of these. Of course I knew better, but I could prove nothing. I took a cab after that and reached my brother's rooms in Pall Mall, where I spent the day. Now I have come round to you, and on my way I was attacked by a rogue with a bludgeon. I knocked him down, and the police have him in custody, but I can tell you that the most absolute confidence that no possible connection would ever be traced between the gentleman upon whose front teeth I have bared my knuckles, and the retiring mathematical coach, who is, I dare say, working out problems upon a blackboard 10 miles away. You will not wonder, Watson, that my first act on entering your rooms was to close your shutters, and that I have been compelled to ask your permission to leave the house by some less conspicuous exit than the front door. I had often admired my friend's courage, but never more than now, as he sat quietly checking off a series of incidences which must have combined to make a day of horror. "You will spend the night here?" I said. "No, my friend, you might find me a dangerous guest. I have my plans laid, and all will be well. Matters have gone so far now that they can move without my help, as far as the arrest goes, though my presence is necessary for a conviction. It is obvious, therefore, that I cannot do better than get away for the few days which remain before the police are at liberty to act. It would be a great pleasure to me, therefore, if you could come on to the continent with me." "The practice is quiet," said I, "and I have an accommodating neighbor. I should be glad to come." "And to start tomorrow morning?" "If necessary." "Oh, yes, it is most necessary. Then these are your instructions, and I beg, my dear Watson, that you will obey them to the letter, for you are now playing a double-handed game with me against the cleverest rogue and the most powerful syndicate of criminals in Europe. Now listen. You will dispatch whatever luggage you intend to take by a trusty messenger, unaddressed, to Victoria tonight. In the morning you will send for a hansom, desiring your man to take neither the first nor the second which may present itself. Into this hansom you will jump, and you will drive to the Strand end of the Lowther Arcade, handing the address to the cabman upon a slip of paper, with a request that he will not throw it away. Have your fare ready, and the instant that your cab stops, dash through the arcade, timing yourself to reach the other door at 9:15. You will find a small brougham waiting close to the curb, driven by a fellow with a heavy black cloak tipped at the corner with red. Into this you will step, and you will reach Victoria in time for the Continental Express." "Where shall I find you?" "At the station. The second first-class carriage from the front will be reserved for us." "The carriage is our rendezvous, then?" "Yes." It was in vain that I asked Holmes to remain for the evening. It was evident to me that he thought he might bring trouble to the roof he was under, and that was the motive which impelled him to go. With a few hurried words as to our plans for the morrow, he arose and came out with me into the garden, clambering over the wall which leads into Mortimer Street, and immediately whistling for a hansom, in which I heard him drive away. In the morning I obeyed Holmes' injunctions to the letter. A hansom was procured with such precautions as would prevent its being one which was placed ready for us, and I drove immediately after breakfast to the Lowther Arcade, through which I hurried at the top of my speed. A brougham was waiting with a very massive driver wrapped in a dark cloak, who, the instant that I had stepped in, whipped up the horse and rattled off to Victoria Station. On my alighting there, he turned the carriage and dashed away again without so much as a look in my direction. So far all had gone admirably. My luggage was waiting for me, and I had no difficulty in finding the carriage which Holmes had indicated, and the less so as it was the only one in the train which was marked engaged. My only source of anxiety now was the non-appearance of Holmes. The station clock marked only 7 minutes from the time when we were due to start. In vain I searched among the groups of travelers and leave-takers for the lithe figure of my friend. There was no sign of him. I spent a few minutes in assisting a venerable Italian priest who was endeavoring to make a porter understand in his broken English that his luggage was to be booked through to Paris. Then, having taken another look around, I returned to my carriage, where I found that the porter, in spite of the ticket, had given me my decrepit Italian friend as a traveling companion. It was useless for me to explain to him that his presence was an intrusion, for my Italian was even more limited than his English, so I shrugged my shoulders resignedly and continued to look out anxiously for my friend. A chill of fear had come over me, as I thought that his absence might mean that some blow had fallen during the night. Already the doors had all been shut and the whistle blown when, "My dear Watson," said a voice, "you have not even condescended to say good morning." I turned in incontrollable astonishment. The aged ecclesiastic had turned his face towards me. For an instant the wrinkles were smoothed away, the nose drew away from the chin, the lower lip ceased to protrude, and the mouth to mumble. The dull eyes regained their fire. The drooping figure expanded. The next, the whole frame collapsed again, and Holmes had gone as quickly as he had come. "Good heavens!" I cried. "How you startled me!" "Every precaution is still necessary," he whispered. "I have reason to think that they are hot upon our trail. Ah, there is Moriarty himself." The train had already begun to move as Holmes spoke. Glancing back, I saw a tall man pushing his way furiously through the crowd and waving his hand as if he desired to have the train stopped. It was too late, however, for we were rapidly gathering momentum, and an instant later had shot clear of the station. "With all our precautions, you see that we have cut it rather fine," said Holmes, laughing. He rose, and throwing off the black cassock and hat which had formed his disguise, he packed them away in a handbag. "Have you seen the morning paper, Watson?" "No." "You haven't seen about Baker Street, then?" "Baker Street? They have set fire to our rooms last night. No great harm is done." "Good heavens, Holmes! This is intolerable!" "They must have lost my track completely after their bludgeoned man was arrested. Otherwise they could not have imagined that I had returned to my rooms. They have evidently taken the precaution of watching you, however, and that is what has brought Moriarty to Victoria. You could not have made any slip in coming. I did exactly what you advised." "Did you find your brougham?" "Yes, it was waiting." "Did you recognize your coachman?" "No." "It was my brother Mycroft. It is an advantage to get about in such a case without taking a mercenary into your confidence, but we must plan what we are to do about Moriarty now. As this is an express, and as the boat runs in connection with it, I should think we have shaken him off very effectively." "My dear Watson, you evidently did not realize my meaning when I said that this man may be taken as being quite on the same intellectual plane as myself. You did not imagine that if I were the pursuer, I should allow myself to be baffled by so slight an obstacle. Why, then, should you think so meanly of him?" "What will he do?" "What I should do." "What would you do, then?" "Engage a special." "But it must be late." "By no means. happens, this train stops at Canterbury, and there is always at least a quarter of an hour's delay at the boat. He will catch us there. One would think that we were the criminals. Let us have him arrested on the arrival. It would be to ruin the works of 3 months. We should get the big fish, but the smaller ones would dart right and left out of the net. On Monday we should have them all. No, an arrest is inadmissible. What then? We shall get out of Canterbury. And then? Well, then we must make a cross-country journey to New Haven, and so over to Dieppe. Moriarty will again do what I should do. He will get on to Paris, mark down our luggage, and wait for 2 days at the depot. In the meantime, we shall treat ourselves to a couple of carpet-bags, encourage the manufacturers of the countries through which we travel, and make our way to our leisure into Switzerland, via Luxembourg and Basel. At Canterbury, therefore, we alighted, only to find that we should have to wait an hour before we could get a train to New Haven. I was still looking rather ruefully about after the rapidly disappearing luggage van which contained my wardrobe, when Holmes pulled my sleeve and pointed up the line. "All ready, you see," said he. Far away from among the Kentish woods there rose a thin spray of smoke. A minute later a carriage and engine could be seen flying along the open curve which leads to the station. We had hardly time to take our place behind the pile of luggage when it passed, with a rattle and a roar, beating a blast of hot air into our faces. "There he goes," said Holmes, as we watched the carriage swing and rock over the points. "There are limits, you see, to our friend's intelligence. It would have been a coup de maître had he deduced that I would deduce and acted accordingly. And what would he have done had he overtaken us? There cannot be the least doubt that he would have made a murderous attack upon me. It is, however, a game in which two may play. The question now is whether we should take the premature lunch here, or run our chance of starving before we reach the buffet at New Haven." We made our way to Brussels that night and spent 2 days there, moving on upon the 3rd day as far as Strasbourg. On the Monday morning, Holmes had telegraphed to the London police, and in the evening we found a reply waiting for us at our hotel. Holmes tore it open, and then with a bitter curse hurled it into the grate. "I might have known," he groaned. "He has escaped." "Moriarty?" "They have secured the whole gang with the exception of him. He has given them the slip. Of course, when I had left the country, there was no one to cope with him. But I did think that I had put the game in their hands. I think that you had better return to England, Watson." "Why?" "Because you will find me a dangerous companion now. This man's occupation is gone. He is lost if he returns to London. If I read his character right, he will devote his whole energies to revenging himself upon me. He said as much in our short interview, and I fancy that he meant it. I should certainly recommend you to return to your practice." It was hardly an appeal to be successful with one who was an old campaigner as well as an old friend. We sat in the Strasbourg salle à manger, arguing the question for half an hour, but the same night we had resumed our journey, we were well on our way to Geneva. For a charming week we wandered up the valley of the Rhone, and then, branching off at Luc, we made our way over the Gemmi Pass, still deep in snow, and so, by way of Interlaken, to Meiringen. I'm sorry, these words are interesting. It was a lovely trip, the dainty greens of the spring below, the virgin white of the winter above, and it was clear to me that never for one instant did Holmes forget the shadow which lay across him. In the homely Alpine villages, or in the lonely mountain passes, I could still tell by his quick glancing eyes and his sharp scrutiny of every face that passed us that he was well convinced that, walk where he would, we could not walk ourselves clear of the danger which was dogging our footsteps. Once I remembered, as we passed over the Gemmi and walked along the border of the melancholy Dauben Sea, a large rock which had been dislodged from the ridge upon our right clattered down and roared into the lake behind us. In an instant Holmes had raced up on it to the ridge, and, standing upon the lofty pinnacle, craned his neck in every direction. It was in vain that our guide assured him that a fall of stones was a common chance in the springtime at that spot. He said nothing, but he smiled at me with the air of a man who sees the fulfillment of that which he had expected. And yet, for all his watchfulness, he was never depressed. On the contrary, I can never recollect having seen him in such exuberant spirits. Again and again he recurred to the fact that he could be assured that society was freed from Professor Moriarty. He would cheerfully bring his own career to its conclusion. "I think that I may go so far as to say, Watson, that I have not lived wholly in vain," he remarked. "If my record were closed tonight, I could still survey it with equanimity. The air of London is the sweeter for my presence. In over 1,000 cases I am not aware that I have ever used my powers upon the wrong side. Of late I have been tempted to look into the problems furnished by nature rather than those more superficial ones for which our artificial state of society is responsible. Your memoirs will draw to an end, Watson, upon the day that I crown my career by the capture or extinction of the most dangerous and capable criminal in Europe. I shall be brief and yet exact in the little which remains for me to tell. It is not a subject on which I would willingly dwell, and yet I am conscious that a duty develops upon me to omit no detail. It was upon the 3rd of May that we reached the little village of Meiringen, where we were put up to the Englischer Hof, then kept by Peter Stuyler, the elder. Our landlord was an intelligent man, and spoke excellent English, having served for 3 years as waiter at the Grosvenor Hotel in London. At his advice, upon the afternoon of the 4th, we set off together with the intention of crossing the hills and spending the night at the hamlet of Rosenlaui. We had strict injunctions, however, on no account to pass the falls of Reichenbach, which were about the halfway up the hills, without making a small detour to see them. It is indeed a fearful place. The torrent, swollen by the melting snow, plunges into a tremendous abyss, from which the spray rolls up like the smoke from a burning house. The shaft into which the river hurls itself is an immense chasm lined by glistening coal-black rocks and narrowing into a creaming, boiling pit of incalculable depth, which brims over and shoots the stream onward over its jagged lip. The long sweep of green water, roaring forever down, and the thick, flickering curtains of spray hissing forever upward, turn a man giddy with their constant whirl and clamor. We stood near the edge, peering down at the gleam of the breaking water far below us against the black rocks, and listening to the half-human shout which came booming up with the spray out of the abyss. The path has been cut halfway round the fall to afford a complete view, but it ends abruptly, and the traveller has to return as he came. We had turned to do so when we saw a Swiss lad come running along it with a letter in his hand. It bore the mark of the hotel which we had just left, and was addressed to me by the landlord. It appeared that within a very few minutes of our leaving, an English lady had arrived who was in the last stage of consumption. She had wintered at Davos Platz, and was journeying now to join her friends at Lucerne, when a sudden hemorrhage had overtaken her. It was thought that she could hardly live a few hours, but it would be a great consolation to her to see an English doctor, and, if I would only return, etc., etc. The good Styler assured me in a postscript that he would himself look upon my compliance as a very great favour, since the lady absolutely refused to see a Swiss physician, and he could not but feel that he was incurring a great responsibility. The appeal was one which could not be ignored. It was impossible to refuse the request of a fellow countryman dying in the strange land. Yet I had my scruples about leaving Holmes. It was finally agreed, however, that he should retain the young Swiss messenger with him as guide and companion, while I returned to Meiringen. My friend would stay some little time at the Fall, he said, and would then walk slowly over the hill to Rosenlaui, where I was to rejoin him in the evening. As I turned away, I saw Holmes with his back against a rock and his arms folded, gazing down at the rush of the waters. It was the last that I was ever destined to see him in this world. When I was near the bottom of the descent, I looked back. It was impossible from that position to see the fall, but I could see the curving path which winds over the shoulder of the hill and leads to it. Along this a man was, I remember, walking very rapidly. I could see his black figure clearly outlined against the green behind him. I noted him and the energy with which he walked, but he passed from my mind again as I hurried on upon my errand. It may have been a little over an hour before I reached Meiringen. Old Styler was standing on the porch of his hotel. "Well," said I, as I came hurrying up, "I trust that she is no worse?" A look of surprise passed over his face, and at the first quiver of his eyebrows my heart turned to lead in my breast. "You did not write this?" I said, pulling the letter from my pocket. "There is no sick Englishwoman in the hotel?" "Certainly not," he cried. "But it has the hotel mark upon it." "Ha! It must have been written by that tall Englishman who came in after you had gone. He said—" But I waited for none of the landlord's explanations. In a tingle of fear, I was already running down the village street and making for the path which I had so lately descended. It had taken me an hour to come down. For all my efforts, 2 more had passed before I found myself at the fall of Reichenbach once more. There was Holmes' alpenstock, still leaning against the rock by which I had left him. There was no sign of him, and it was in vain that I shouted. My only answer was my own voice reverberating in a rolling echo from the cliffs before me. It was the sight of that alpenstock which turned me cold and sick. He had not gone to Rosenlaui, then. He had remained on that 3-foot path, with sheer wall on one side and sheer drop upon the other, until his enemy had overtaken him. The young Swiss had gone too. He had probably been in the pay of Moriarty, and had left the 2 men together. And then what had happened? Who was to tell us what had happened then? I stood for a minute or two to collect myself, for I was dazed with the horror of the thing. Then I began to think of Holmes' own methods, and to try to practice them in reading this tragedy. It was, alas, only too easy to do. During our conversation, we had not gone to the end of the path, and the alpenstock marked the place where we had stood. The blackish soil is kept forever soft by the incessant drift of spray, and a bird would leave its tread upon it. 2 lines of footmarks were clearly marked upon the further end of the path, both leading away from me. There were none returning. A few yards from the end of the soil was all ploughed up into a patch of mud, and the brambles and ferns which fringed the chasm were torn and bedraggled. I lay upon my face and peered over with the spray spouting up all around me. It had darkened since I left, and now I could only see here and there the glistening of moisture upon the black walls, and far away down to the end of the shaft the gleam of the broken water. I shouted, but only that same half-human cry of the fall was borne back to my ears. But it was destined that I should, after all, have a last word of greeting from my friend and comrade. I have said that his alpenstock had been left leaning against a rock which jutted onto the path. From the top of this boulder the gleam of something bright caught my eye, and raising my hand, I found that it came from the silver cigarette case which he used to carry. As I took it up, a small square of paper upon which it had lain fluttered down onto the ground. Unfolding it, I found that it consisted of 3 pages torn from his notebook and addressed to me. It was characteristic of the man that the direction was as precise, and the writing was firm and clear, as though it had been written in his study. "My dear Watson," said he, "I write these few lines through the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who awaits my convenience for the final discussion of those questions which lie between us. He has been giving me a sketch of the methods by which he avoided the English police and kept himself informed of our movements. They certainly confirm the very high opinion which I have formed from his abilities. I am pleased to think that I shall be able to free society from any further effects of his presence, though I fear that it is at a cost which will give pain to my friends, and especially, my dear Watson, to you. I have already explained to you, however, that my career had in any case reached its crisis, and that no possible conclusion to it could be more congenial to me than this. Indeed, if I may make a full confession to you, I was quite convinced that the letter from Meringen was a hoax, and I allowed you to depart on that errand under the persuasion that some development of this sort would follow. Tell Inspector Patterson that the papers which he needs to convict the gang are in Pigeonhole M, done up in the blue envelope and inscribed Moriarty. I made every disposition of my property before leaving England, and handed it to my brother Mycroft. Pray give my greetings to Mrs. Watson, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes. In a few words may suffice to tell the little that remains. An examination by experts leaves little doubt that a personal contest between the 2 men ended, as it could hardly fail to end in such a situation, in their reeling over, locked in each other's arms. Any attempt at recovering the bodies was absolutely hopeless, and there, deep in that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of their greatest generation. The Swiss youth was never found again, and there can be no doubt that he was one of the numerous agents whom Moriarty kept in his employ. As to the gang, it will be within the memory of the public how completely the evidence which Holmes had accumulated exposed their organization, and how heavily the hand of the dead man weighed upon them. Of their terrible chief, few details came out during the proceedings, and if I have now been compelled to make a clear statement of this career, it is due to those injudicious champions who have endeavored to clear his memory by attacks upon him whom I shall ever regard as the best and the wisest man I have ever known. So that is the completion of the collection, The Complete Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. There is a collection of short stories after this called The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and beginning next week, we can either continue on with The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, or we can start, I have a few books that we can maybe do. There is The Phantom of the Opera and The Scarlet Pimpernel. I don't think I have any other ones on hand, but, I have access to buying any number of them at the store, because I work at an independent bookstore. So I'm going to put a little poll up on Twitter and on Discord and up on Facebook. So, if you have any I can't think of the right word. You can, definitely express your opinions as to whether you want us to continue with Sherlock Holmes or if you want to take a little break, and we can always return to Sherlock Holmes later. But yeah, anyways, that is the conclusion of this stream today. We went a little over because they were 2 pretty long stories. Tomorrow Oh, hi, Corel. How are you doing? Thanks for hanging out with me. I will be doing story time tomorrow. It is, yeah, sometimes that's all we can hope for. I will be doing story time tomorrow. It is the Heidi one. And I don't know if you saw my schedule or not. I will be doing Heidi story time tomorrow and on Thursday. And then, of course, returning with Older Ages story time next week. Anyways, yeah, I'll probably do another game stream tonight, continuing with Littlewood. That was a lot of fun, and I just kind of keep thinking of it. Yeah. Thank you so much again for hanging out with me, for listening to my story, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.